Now I think the next two questions are related and probably addressed towards Professor Pan. How do you keep the balance between developing economically and environmental protection such as climate change? Should we regard economic development as the most significant issue for a country? How do you balance sustainability and climate protection with the need for economic growth?
Well, this is actually a value judgment, and it's a personal preference, and different people would have different, judgment. And in my view, we need to have, the basic necessities for human development guaranteed. And then for the wasteful and luxurious part, we should certainly avoid and discourage. And then the balance, I think that the balance point should not be that part of the current definition of high quality way of living, like luxurious ways of SUVs, large houses, in winter very high temperature, in summer very low temperature, using air conditioning. These are not sort of quality of living. These are not for basic necessities. So for economic development, because that's the right to an individual human beings, so we must guarantee the basic necessities of everybody on Earth. And then for anything above that part, it's not a criminal sort of action, but it should not be encouraged or should not be promoted. And then in that case, we should have some sort of mechanism to discourage using the market approaches. So I think that in that way, we should strike a balance between development and sustainability.
Thank you. Now we have two policy-related questions for Dr. Lee, specific for Hong Kong. Could you comment on the situation in Hong Kong on the policy side for implementing climate change-related policies? What obstacles do you see? And also, what has the government of Hong Kong done to date in anticipation of the severe impacts of climate change that you've described?
We are actually the scientific institution responsible for climate change science, and our data and information has been supplied to the Policy Bureau. And I think most of our results, if not all, already reflected in the latest consultative document. I think it's being circulated to Hong Kong public for their opinion. I think that's what we've done. And basically, I think locally the scientists and engineers are quite positive about what is being done here. I think instead of a challenge to them, I think they tend to think of it as an opportunity whereby people can go into new areas, renewable energy, green energy, and I think there's a lot of opportunity for them to really do better. So I tend to think of it in a positive way. And I would like to go back to the last question about the effect of climate change on health. In fact, we've done research on the flu pattern over the past 10 years, influenza. And 10 years ago, we used to have only a peak during springtime, and that's it. But over the past 10 years, we start to see a peak in summertime as well. And we think that's strange. And we cannot blame it on climate change yet, but we think that could be a factor. And this peak in summer is going to get more permanent. It's going to surpass the winter peak. And I think that's one area of concern that we need to go into further. Thank you.
Thank you. A couple of other questions, and we just have a few more minutes. can any of you comment on the role of population growth and the need to curb population growth in order to reach those kind of, cuts in emissions that you've all described?
Well, I think this is really vital, simply because all the demand is from people, and all the emission is also from the people, and then we do, because for current population, we inherit everything from our ancestors, from previous generations, and we are also responsible for our future generations. And then if there is no control on the growth of population, and then the demand for energy consumption would certainly increase, and also the emission would certainly increase as well. So I think that if we calculate the emission reductions from China, the biggest contribution must be from population control, simply because of the avoidance of some 400 million, births, and this is the most, single contribution to emission reductions. And this policy, if it continues, and will have a somewhat more important role as well. And also, if we look at the OECD member states, their emission has been somewhat stabilized. For one thing, is that their economy is matured, and for another, that is their population has been somewhat also stabilized. So this is very crucial. And then in China, we have, for the family planning policy, we have a slogan that is, for fewer children and more wealth. And this would apply for, for other economies as well. I think that this is a very vitally important factor. Otherwise, we would not have a possibility, for emission control in the future.
Thank you. And since I don't want to keep you any more from lunch, I'm going to close with one more set of questions, which is, what models of success would you all point to as situations where policymakers have developed and implemented successful policies to slow the rate of climate change? And how well have they been able to measure the success of those policies? Who'd like to take a crack at that? Yes, please.
I think a very concrete example is how we dealt with the ozone hole problem. It is relatively a smaller scale problem economically, in that it actually affects a smaller part of the economic sector. But when you thought about the whole process of the detection of the ozone hole, and then the very quick response from the human scientific community at explaining the chemistry and the dynamics behind that ozone hole problem, and then how the world governments congregate in Montreal and then really get serious about the problem, ban many of the CFCs that were responsible for the ozone hole, and now going into the monitoring phase at measuring how the ozone hole is healing. And I think this is a very good example of how we dealt with the environmental crisis.
That's an excellent example, and if you hadn't quoted it, I would have come along with that myself. But maybe I can also raise a slightly broader issue, which again focuses on the Antarctic, which is where, of course, the ozone hole was discovered and which led to the Montreal Protocol. And in the Antarctic, we do have a treaty which has evolved now for over 50 years and places this area of our planet, which is round about 5% of the surface area, as an international domain for science. And that treaty has withstood many changes in global politics, and it has brought into effect also measures, for instance, such as the banning for 50 years of geophysical exploration and exploitation of mineral resources in the Antarctic, and has placed a girdle around the Antarctic for fishing and related exploitation of marine species, which is very carefully controlled. So I think we'd have another example of where we put our mind to it, governments sign up to and can protect the environment, And we just need to go a further step to have maybe a treaty which is worldwide that starts to encompass many of the issues related to climate change that we've heard about.
Yes, I mean, one additional excitement about the Montreal Protocol to reduce the ozone depletion is the fact that one should remember that it wasn't all countries that signed the protocol in 1987. It was only 40 countries which agreed to move ahead by themselves and implement the protocol, and then countries joined when it was clear to everyone that this was in fact beneficial not only for humanity to avoid a planetary risk, but also in terms of economic development. So it showed the value, in fact, of being pioneers and daring to step ahead. There are unfortunately not many examples of good policies that have abated our overuse of fossil fuels. I can only think of one, and it's not surprising being a Swede to take an egoistic approach to this, but one should remember that there's one country on the planet that has operated a €100 per ton carbon dioxide carbon tax for 20 years, namely Sweden. €100 is roughly twice as high as most economic science indicates that we would need to really change incentives. So at €50 and above, or $60 and above, you would start seeing real investments away from fossil fuels. Sweden has operated €100, which has shifted away a whole fossil fuel-based heating sector into renewable energies, and done so while still decoupling with very, very significant economic growth and reducing carbon emissions, which is quite an interesting success story of using tax without jeopardizing economic growth. Another example, I think, is the decarbonization of the whole transport sector in Brazil, which was done with very strong regulations towards sustainable ethanol-based mobile transport in a country scale. And the final one is, of course, the great success we're starting to see on forests. I think the red agenda in the climate negotiations is the little strike of hope we're starting to see to preserve the remaining rainforest, even though that cannot be a substitution to acting on fossil fuels.
Well, thank you very much. There are many more very intriguing and thoughtful questions from the audience. I'm sorry we are not able to address them all here, but I encourage you to approach our excellent panelists during the lunch break if you can find them and ask your questions. But in the meantime, thank you to all of our panelists for their really thoughtful and helpful contributions here.